Hey students, we are going to quickly run through what we talked about in class, but these are our foundational principles of movement that leads us into our 3C's, so cueing, critical elements, and common errors. And these are adapted for all movement, whether it's motor skills, but especially fitness from the Yoga Fit curriculum that goes through 7 principles alignment for yoga, fits everything else. So here we go. First thing that you need to know is that these principles were developed and are first and foremost, we use them when we're looking at safety. And that's the very first thing. If we're looking at a mover, teaching them a movement, we want them to be safe, number one, before we move them on or progress them to anything else. So we want to make sure that they are safe, and or if something is unsafe and they're already moving, we want to be able to correct it so it does become safe. And then I mentioned beginning of the 3C's, so critical elements, cueing, and then our common error. This is the great place to start. Later, we add in the technical specifics to the actual movement and how to do it. But really, we look at what do we need to do. And a lot of these, a couple of them in this list you'll see are from the first phase of teaching a movement in the setup or the start or the stance. Some of them are in the dynamic portion, and then we'll see some of them come back to the final or finishing or recovery phase. And then part number 3 down here, I like to consider these a starting point for instruction. Most, not quite all, but for most. We have a few examples I'm going to be jumping back and forth through. So from these slides, then I have a few different videos, some stuff on Instagram, a couple things on YouTube that we're going to look at as well to help go through some of these main points. We have our true trust examples here. We have this gentleman who is doing, this is a warrior 2 pose in yoga. So it uses essentially a lunge. He's got his arms out, front view, and then we've got this female who's doing 2 variations, could be a progression, but top one, we consider it tabletop pose or quadruped, so on hands and knees. And then she's transitioning into what's called a bird dog. So we see that commonly in physical therapy. That comes from the rehab world. We see it in yoga as well. So principle numero uno is establishing base. So base is however we connect with the most firm or unstable surface. So in our yoga example, the floor, that's our base, that's our surface, or that's our surface, our feet are the base. And we want to make sure that the base is firm and then it's active. So when we have feet down on the floor and they're supporting us, we want to have active pressure down into the floor. So we're pushing force down. So if we need to eventually move or jump, that we'll be able to take force back up with us. We also want to make sure that in our base, especially if it's a stationary position, we have our joints stacked for as much support as possible, and the joint stacked will come back and through again later. And we want to make sure that we're using that force, pushing down. I think of like a tree rooting down. We want to plant roots down. Say there was a wall in front of this gentleman and he was able to flex or put his hand into extension and push against that wall. Same thing if his hand was a base, and we see that over here in our quadruped position. So we have hands. We want to make sure we have as much surface area as possible. So anytime we have the hands on the floor, on a wall, we want to have spread fingers so we have as much area here that can connect and push force away. And then we have knees, maybe tops of toes are going to be assisting. And then same thing when we switch to the bird dog option, the left hand is the front base, right knee, and the rest of it's extended. So that's what we've got for our base. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory here in this case. Moving along, I'm going to use these first 2 examples again. Core stability. So it's all of the muscles of the trunk, and it can also relate to some of the muscles above and below secondary. So we think of the trunk, every single thing in the abdominal space, in the back, the hips associate or affiliate. We also could include potentially the glutes, and in our bird dog example, the shoulders are secondary. So core is engaged, but we're going to keep some connections between the lats, how the lats connect with that trunk space as well. So it's isolating and contracting. It's essentially an isometric contraction of the core of the trunk space to make sure that we have stability in a stationary movement, or if it's something dynamic, create that core stability first, and then we move into that. So here in bird dog, core stability first, neutral, and then she extends the arm and the leg back, core stability stays. If he was going from a different variation of a pose, he would create core stability first and then transition into his warrior two. I want to jump out for a second and show you some of the videos that I've got. Let's do our kids videos that we've got. So we have, here's a little tip for you, something I love that's a great example of physical literacy YouTube channel, and they're also on Instagram. It is 3 kids, all boys, set of twins, 3-year-old twins and a 5-year-old brother, and their dad takes them through the most functional and physically literate type of play. They're in a couple lessons and classes, but this is mostly stuff that they have in their garage. So I love showing some of the videos and stuff that they do. Here's their Instagram. So I'm going to show this example. I had it pulled up before. So this is the 5-year-old. He's on his skateboard. Obviously, he's learning how to skateboard. He has a developmentally appropriate board, so it's kind of smaller. Look at his feet on the board. He's using force, and he has a ball. He's working on a balance activity his dad made up for him. So he has strong base through the floor as he goes. He's crushing it. All right, we're going to come back to that one later. So base is really solid. For him to maintain that position on the board, core has to be really engaged as well. And then we're going to look at a couple front squats here. So this video is from CrossFit. One little tip, no matter if you hate CrossFit or love it, they have a massive video library for movements, and they give you some great points of performance over here. So I do like using them. So we can see base is really, really strong. His feet are nice and flat. They're not inverting or everting. He's not shifting forwards or backwards. And then if you look at his core stability, so the midline, there's not any shaking, his back isn't bending or flexing because that core is really, really stable. And if you've ever done a front squat before, especially a barbell front squat, core stability, especially in the anterior part of the body, is incredibly important here. So nice little example we've got there. We're going to jump back to our presentation. Next, dynamic tension. It goes hand in hand with base and core stability. These are kind of like my power three, especially when you're in the setup or initiation of a movement. So just like we contract the core before we get ready to do something, if we're getting ready to skateboard, throw the ball down, do a front squat, bird dog, warrior two, whatever, when we're gonna add more movement to it, or when we have limbs that are gonna extend beyond just the core, we wanna contract as many muscles as possible so that we can become as stable and stationary or in movement. So it's an extension of core, and we wanna think of activating from core all the way out through the extremities. So instead of, if I have my hands reaching forward, instead of having just loose spaghetti arms, I wanna have every muscle contracted as I go forward. Same thing if I go all the way up. If I'm holding something up overhead, don't want to be slack. I want to be active so that the extension starts in the core and reaches all the way up. So here in bird dog, great example, core active, no other movement here. Arm is extended very actively, leg is extended very actively, and then all the way down through base. And then same thing, even with the support leg. And then in a warrior two example, we don't just have the feet just resting on the floor, they're actively pushing down. Think of rooting down every muscle in the leg. When I teach yoga, I teach this pose, I always cue my students to engage the quadriceps as much as possible. So it is a straight leg, mostly straight leg with the back leg. So to have that back leg straight, you want to have an extended leg. We contract through the quadriceps. And then even here, this leg is bent, that lunge type of stance. We want to be pushing through the floor, active through the leg, core is strong, and then look at how the arms are straight out, straight back. And a tip I usually will tell people is, say they're doing poses like this that are more stretches or might be more yoga-like. Not only does it keep us safe when we want to add dynamic movement, but if you're looking to do something like this for muscular endurance, it's essentially an isometric contraction if you're in a stationary position. And that is going to increase the heart rate slightly. It is going to challenge your muscular fitness in that endurance kind of space. And so it's a really, really good way to keep that active body as we're going through movement. All right, we're going to do another one, then jump back to a couple examples that are videos again. Next, we want to keep the spine aligned. So this is considered a neutral spine, and we'll see some examples in the front squat too, what neutral is. It's maintaining our natural lumbar curve. So here in neutral, we've got base, we've got good dynamic tension, core activation, spine is aligned, and then when she transitions, spine is still aligned. She's not sagging down, she's not rounding, and then we can't see the back view at all, but it looks pretty nice and level, nice and neutral here. So the head, the crown of the head is stacked over the neck, the axis, all the way down through the spine, all the way down through the pubic bone. And a big thing here to notice, anytime, this is a big, major cue for push-up. A major common error we see is when people are doing push-ups, they'll lift their head up and look forward. Often if we're instructing them, they want to see us, or if they're really struggling or suffering, their head's going to hang through. And so we want to make sure anytime they're on their hands like this, we want to have, I just say, keep the crown of your head or head in line with your spine. So if the spine is going this way, top of the head has to go this way. If the spine, say it's a downward facing dog, is going up, the head is going to be down in that space as well. And we're going to go through stack the joints too. So stacking the joints, I mentioned that earlier with base, but extremely important. So anything that's involved in direct supported type of positioning should be stacked while keeping dynamic tension and base. So here, say this was a push-up or this quadruped, we have shoulders stacked directly over the hands. So shoulder joint stacked over the wrist joint, all the way active up through the arms, active through the core to keep us safe. Same thing here. You can see there's a tiny little adjustment back. It's not quite as perfect. Her shoulder pulls back just a little bit, but we do see here too, hips and knees. Nice, really good alignment right underneath, keeping those joints in a good supported position. Musculature has to support the joints too. That's why I always say core stability and dynamic tension. Don't just rely only on the joints. We need the muscles and connective tissue to be stacked. And then pretty good example here for the most part, we have knee stacked mostly over the ankle, looks pretty solid in this type of position. We also see shoulders stacked over the hips, so a nice square neutral position here. So let's jump out, take a couple examples from a few videos. Let's see, we're gonna look at a snatch here. So this is a lift we haven't looked at yet. So this is an athlete doing, for her, I don't think it's a PR, but I think it's a pretty heavy lift. And so she has base with her feet. Even though she lifts them up on the prep, she pushes down hard, and she's keeping dynamic tension through her spine, through that whole body as she goes through that lift. All right, another example we're going to look at in the front squat. This is a great example. So we already talked about base. We already talked about core stability, dynamic tension. We're going to play it again, and we're going to look at our joints stacked. And so he's got a pretty good job of keeping shoulders over the hips right here. As he goes down, there's no shifting left and right laterally. And then from our side view, you can see a side view in a second. So spine maintaining neutral. So he does have natural lumbar curve in the spine, and that is okay. We want to maintain that lumbar curve, especially in these movements. He's got good core stability. You can even see the cue here. It's talking about maintaining that lumbar curve as well. All right, couple more to run through back on our presentation. So in addition to stacking the joints, we're going to talk about knees now. Two things that are important, not necessarily related to the knees, but very, very important. So we want to have, if applicable, not every situation, it's not necessary all the time. There's a few times where it's controlled, where you can have the knee maybe not necessarily stacked over the joint, but with the knees, we want to have a soft knee, and that means bent. And then we want to have it aligned with the toes. Our front squat example is going to be a really, really good one with that. For here, she has bent knees as part of her base, so we don't really have to worry about it. But something I do like to pay attention to, we want to keep them aligned with her hips and her feet aligned straight back. We can't see this from a front view, but if we did, we would see her knees would not be further out, wide, or more narrow than where her hips are. And so a couple examples that are good here, we'll go back to our front squat, see if we can find a frontal view. So here with the knees, so obviously he's doing a squat, so the knees are bent, but he's keeping them in line with his toes. And I'll usually cue to the outside toes. If you cue in with the big toe, the knee might collapse in. So we want to make sure that that knee is tracking in a very controlled way as the knees bend and as the hips drop down. The knees continue to track in that same line as the hips go up. So that's our example of tracking, keeping those knees in alignment. And then we're gonna let's go back and look at a couple of videos. Let's go back this one more time. So we talked about base here, core activation. So for him to have that little wiggle on the board, but still stay on it, tons of core activation. And even when he takes the ball up overhead, look at how high he reaches it. He stacks his shoulder over his hips. It's called full extension up with his shoulder, keeping that joint stacked. He cheated a little bit on that one. See, on his right hand, you can tell, maybe not all the way up all the time. And even when he goes down into a squat on a skateboard, he has his knees in alignment. They're going out over his little toes. They're not collapsing in on the way down or on the way up. So really, really important there. He does such a good job with that. Let's see, one more. Let's talk about, I think this is a jumping one. I don't know what he's doing. We're going to take a little peek at it, see what happens. All right, so look at, that's pretty incredible. Look at how he lands. That looks like it's the final. So when he jumps or gets ready to jump, look at how when he stands up, he doesn't go to locked legs. He keeps a bent knee. That's called a soft knee. It gives him more stability, more ability to adjust, especially in this very hard balancing option or balancing pose. So that's why you're going to see surfers, skateboarders on that board with those bent knees allows for more muscle activation versus if they're just locking out through the leg. That's a crazy example. I want a jumping one. Here's jumping one. I think he's doing, might be doing some hops. Yep, so he's doing some hops. So single leg to single leg, sometimes he's switching. So notice when he takes off, he lands, bent knee, never locked out. Even when he lands on the floor, lands in that jump, knees are going to be soft. That allows his glutes and his hips and the other leg muscles to absorb force. And anytime we're in a balancing type of position, especially standing balance, so we see that sometimes in yoga, for example, we always want to have a slight micro bend because it allows us to use the musculature and supportive tissues around the joint to support the joint, not only the actual bone on bone, the bones themselves. Next, shoulders, we want to have them back and down. So we want to make sure that the shoulders are pulled back. They are down away from the ears, and then the muscles of the upper back, the scapula, are pulled and retracted scapula that helps our core engagement extend up a little higher. But it puts us out of this position where we feel tense and then where we feel rounded, where we have that hunchback or that flexed upper back or tight thoracic spine. So we want to be able, or it's maybe open thoracic spine, but we want to make sure the shoulders are pulled back. If we drive, text, computer all day long like this, we need to actively really think about keeping ourselves up and back. And so here, even in a push-up variation or this quadruped, she has nice room between her shoulders and her ears. You can tell her shoulders are down. And hopefully, a little tough to tell here, but shoulder blades have to be engaged for her to be able to push through the floor. If we were to flip this warrior two around and show him the other way, his back, especially in warrior two, because those arms are out, I want you to try this right now. Put your arms out to the sides. I'm just gonna let them slack a little bit, let the torso slack, and then create core stability, dynamic tension, pull the shoulder blades in, retract them in towards each other. That's a really active position. Eventually you're gonna get fatigued. You're gonna be tired with that as well. Hinging at the hips. So we want to make sure anytime we're moving, especially in and out of forward bends, we want to make sure that we hinge at the hip So I usually have people put their hands at the hips. Here is the hip where his t-shirt and his pants meet. So you can even see here, anytime you do a lunge, where the lower body and then the upper body where they converge, that is the hip, that's the hinge point. The waist, belly button that's up here, we don't want to see any rounding or flexing there in almost all situations. Here we have a natural, this is a hinge because it's in a bird dog. So she has her knees down on the ground. We have extended, and then flexed is when that leg is down. And then a word on levers. So this isn't necessarily a technique tip, but this is a really great way how to modify to scale or make it easier or harder. And especially when we are hip hinging, so letting the hips go back, hips go forward, it's safer, unless the athlete or mover is ready, to keep the levers shorter. So what that means, we have levers down closer to the center of mass. When this is extended, considered a longer lever. Shorter levers here, longer lever reaching out. Let's say she was doing a full push-up. So she's got her hands down. Let's say she has her whole body back, toes down on the floor behind her. Longer levers because those knees are up. But as soon as the knees go down, or say she was doing a knee plank, that would be the shorter version of it. Here with his arms, if you brought them into his chest like this or at his hips, that would shorten the levers as well, makes it a little easier. And then this last part, reducing the strain of the muscles of the lower back, whether it's legs or even arms, is a key thing to make the movement a little bit progress down. So down progress it, or just keeping that back in a bit of a safer position is important. We're going to go through and check out a couple more. Let's see if I can find something that has a little bit more of a hip hinge. So we're going to go sumo deadlift high pull progression, and it definitely does have a hip hinge here. So if we can see a side view, maybe not, I think they're all from the front. So for her, she has a close grip because it's considered a sumo deadlift. And for her, when she has the down position, her hips go back and then she opens the legs to stand up tall. She's not squatting down into this movement. So instead of squatting down, her hips are going to the back of the room. When she bends the knees to take that bar down in front of her shins, hips come forward as she pulls the bar up. So that's an example of hip hinge. Let's go to deadlift or regular deadlift. So she pushes the bar down, lets it return to the floor. She's not squatting. She's keeping the bar close to her body, and the hips are hinging back and forth. So let's find side view again. Hips go back, 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 then the knees bend. Once the bar is past her knees on the way down, then those knees start to bend. But first, hips go back, hinge, hinge, then they bend down. Same thing on the way up, bar pulls up, then we unhinge at the hips. So that knee is a pretty crucial position for any sort of hinging, especially if it's going to be with an implement, especially with a barbell that we see here. All right, so that's our overview of the foundational principles of alignment.